She was sitting on the ground, holding her daughter in her arms, silently counting the little money she had left. Every number was a decision: food or diapers. Then something happened that no one in that place expected. A successful man in a suit walked toward her. He knelt down in front of her and held out a credit card. He asked for nothing. He explained nothing. He only said she could use that card for 24 hours. Now let me ask you something. What would you do in her place? Would you accept it, refuse it, or be afraid of what comes next? Leave your answer in the comments. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on notifications. Because here, every single day, we share stories that touch the soul.
No one knew what was about to happen that day. Not the cashier, not the customers rushing through the aisles, and certainly not the poor single mother standing quietly near the back of the grocery store, clutching a small basket that barely held the essentials of survival. Bread, milk, rice, diapers. She picked up the diapers, put them back, then picked them up again, her hands shaking as she calculated numbers only she could see. Her clothes were clean, but worn thin by years of sacrifice. Her eyes carried a tiredness deeper than sleep deprivation, the exhaustion of someone who had been strong for far too long. What she didn't realize was that someone was watching her. A man who owned private jets, companies, and entire city blocks. A billionaire. He stood a few aisles away, dressed simply, unnoticed. To most people, he was just another customer. But as he watched her silently debate whether her child's needs were worth the last dollars she had, something inside him began to crack, because he had seen that look before. And it had belonged to his mother. He remembered being 6 years old, standing in a store just like this one. Remembered the way his mother used to smile at him while quietly putting items back on the shelf. Remembered how she would say, "We don't need that today," even when they both knew they did. He remembered the nights she skipped meals, the way her hands shook when bills came in the mail, the way pride and desperation lived side by side in her eyes. That memory hit him like a wave. The woman near the back of the store took a slow breath. She placed the diapers into the basket, then, after one last glance at the price, removed them again. Her shoulders sagged, just slightly, as if conceding defeat. That was the moment he moved. He didn't approach her loudly or dramatically. He simply walked past, paused, and gently placed the diapers back into her basket. She looked up, startled, ready to protest. "Please," he said softly, his voice steady but warm. "Let me." Her first instinct was refusal. Pride rose quickly, the kind built from years of doing everything alone. "I can't," she said. "You don't have to." "I know," he replied, "but I want to." She searched his face for pity and found none, only understanding. At the register, he paid for her groceries. Not just the basics, but fresh fruit, formula, a warm blanket she hadn't even allowed herself to touch. The cashier's eyes widened. The line behind them fell silent. When the receipt printed, the total was insignificant to him. But to her, it felt like oxygen. Tears finally came, quiet, unstoppable. "Thank you," she whispered, the words heavy with relief and disbelief. He smiled gently. "Someone once did the same for my mother," he said. "I never forgot it." She left the store that day with more than groceries. She left with dignity intact, with hope restored, with the reminder that even in moments of unbearable weight, kindness can appear, unannounced, unexpected, and life-changing. And the billionaire watched her walk away knowing that, for the first time in years, the wealth he carried had finally felt like it was worth something. When he finally walked toward her, he didn't know what he was about to do, only that he couldn't walk away. He spoke softly, carefully, as if one wrong word might shatter her. He asked if she was okay. She flinched. Years of struggle had trained her to be alert, especially around strangers offering concern. Instinct took over before reason could catch up. She forced a polite smile and said she was fine, that she was just thinking, just tired, just another day. He nodded, but he didn't leave. Then came the moment that would change everything. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a black credit card, the kind without limits, without questions. It caught the fluorescent light as he held it out to her, not like an offer, but like a possibility. He told her she could use it for the next 24 hours, anything she needed, food, clothes, medicine, rent, no conditions, no cameras, no expectations. The store seemed to hold its breath. Her reaction wasn't gratitude, it wasn't excitement, it was fear. Her face drained of color as she shook her head, stepping back as if the card were dangerous. Her fingers curled protectively around the basket. "I can't," she said quickly. "I really can't." He tried to reassure her, but the words spilled out of her, urgent and shaking. She didn't want charity. She didn't want to owe anyone. She had learned the hard way that gifts often came with invisible strings, favors expected, dignity slowly erased, independence quietly taken. Accepting help had never been simple. It had always cost her something. "I'll figure it out," she whispered, more to herself than to him. That refusal, raw, proud, trembling, hit him harder than any business loss he had ever faced. Because this wasn't greed standing in front of him, it was survival. He saw how tightly she held herself together, how every instinct screamed that accepting help meant weakness, danger, dependence. He saw a woman who had been carrying the weight of 2 lives alone and had learned to trust no one with it. And in that moment, he understood that money wasn't the problem. Fear was. He slowly lowered the card, not offended, not angry, only humbled. For the first time in years, he realized that the greatest luxury he possessed wasn't wealth, it was safety. The freedom to say yes without consequences. The privilege of believing help could be given without harm. He met her eyes and spoke again, quieter this time. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Not now, not ever." She didn't answer, but something shifted, just slightly. A crack in the armor she had spent years building, and in that fragile pause between fear and trust, both of them stood changed, knowing that whatever happened next would no longer be just about money, but about restoring something far more valuable, the right to accept kindness without losing oneself. Her voice broke as she explained why. She told him that help often came with strings attached, that promises disappeared as quickly as they were made, that hope, when you were poor, could be cruel, because it rose just high enough to hurt when it fell. She spoke slowly at first, then all at once, as if the words had been waiting years for permission to exist. She talked about her child, how she skipped meals so her son wouldn't notice there wasn't enough food, how she learned to smile while her stomach burned, telling him she'd already eaten, how she worked until her body ached, mornings that began before sunrise, nights that ended in silence, and still, every month, she came up short. No matter how hard she tried, the numbers never fully lined up. She admitted she prayed every night, not for wealth, not for miracles, just for one single day without fear. One morning where she didn't wake up calculating survival. One night where she could sleep without rehearsing worst-case scenarios in the dark. As she spoke, tears streamed down her face despite her desperate attempt to stay strong. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed by their betrayal. But they kept coming. Strength, it turned out, had limits. The billionaire felt his chest tighten. This wasn't a problem money could easily erase. This wasn't about groceries or rent or numbers on a receipt. This was years of quiet suffering finally given a voice, years of swallowing pride, of choosing between impossible options, of loving a child more than oneself in ways that never made headlines. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush her. He simply listened. When she finally accepted the card, it wasn't because she wanted luxury. It was because he promised her dignity. No repayment, no story, no obligation, just trust. Her hand trembled as she took it, holding the card as if it might disappear, as if reality might correct itself and take the relief away. For a moment, she closed her eyes, not in triumph but in exhaustion, allowing herself to believe, just for that instant, that fear might loosen its grip. He turned away then. Not because the moment was over, but because his own eyes were already burning with tears. And as he walked back through the store, He understood something he had never learned in boardrooms or balance sheets, that the most powerful gift he could offer wasn't money. It was the rare, radical act of believing someone's pain and choosing to honor it. What happened over the next 24 hours shattered every expectation he had. He had prepared himself for the worst without admitting it. Reckless spending, emotional choices, maybe temptation, maybe regret. After all, that was the story people like to tell about the poor, that given abundance, they would waste it. Instead, the transactions told a story far more powerful. Groceries, practical, measured, unremarkable to anyone else. Children's clothes, modest, necessary, bought with care. Utility bills, overdue, finally cleared. Quiet weights lifted from tired shoulders. A school payment, a pharmacy charge for medicine. No luxury, no waste, no impulse, just responsibility. He scrolled slowly, his breath shallow, as if moving too fast might disturb the truth forming in front of him. Each line felt intentional, considered. Not a single purchase was about escape. Every one of them was about stability. Then came the charge that made him stop breathing. A used laptop. Old, cheap, obsolete by every technological standard he lived by. Something he would have dismissed without a second glance. But he understood immediately what it meant to her. Opportunity, education, a future. His hands began to shake as he stared at the statement. This woman, who had lived with nothing but fear and restraint, had chosen to invest. Not in comfort, not in indulgence, in possibility, in learning, in a door that might one day open wider for her child or for herself. She hadn't tried to escape her life. She had tried to build one. Each transaction revealed restraint, love, and dignity. Values he had spent a lifetime claiming to admire, yet rarely witnessed so clearly. And in that quiet moment, alone with a list of numbers on a screen, something fundamental shifted inside him. For the first time in his life, money didn't feel powerful. It felt heavy. Heavy with responsibility. Heavy with truth. Heavy with the realization that wealth, when placed in the hands of someone who knows hunger, fear, and sacrifice, becomes something far greater than a tool. It becomes a mirror, and what it showed him that day would follow him far beyond those 24 hours, into every decision he would ever make again. When the 24 hours ended, she returned the card exactly as promised. No hesitation, no excuses, no requests for more. She placed it gently in his hand as if returning something fragile. She thanked him quietly, her voice steady, her pride intact. There was no performance in her gratitude, only sincerity, measured and restrained, the way someone thanks another when they refuse to let desperation define them. Then she handed him a folded piece of paper. "This is for you," she said. Inside was a note written in uneven handwriting, the ink slightly smudged as if tears had fallen before the words had time to dry. He unfolded it slowly, unaware that his life was about to fracture in the most unexpected way. She wrote that because of him, her child would sleep warm that night, fed, bathed, wrapped in clean clothes, without hearing her cry in the bathroom after midnight. She wrote that for one day, fear had loosened its grip, that she could breathe, that she could rest. She wrote that even if nothing else ever changed, that single day had reminded her of something she had almost forgotten, that she was still human, still worthy, still seen. The words destroyed him. Right there in the grocery store, surrounded by strangers who continued scanning items and pushing carts, the billionaire broke down in tears. He turned away, shoulders shaking, overwhelmed by a truth no balance sheet had ever taught him. Because in that moment, he realized something profound. She hadn't used his credit card. She had given him meaning. Meaning in a world where numbers replaced faces. Meaning where profit had long silenced empathy. Meaning that no acquisition, no investment, no empire had ever provided. And as he stood there, holding a simple piece of folded paper like a sacred object, he knew, with painful, undeniable clarity, that this was only the beginning. Not of her story, of his. That night, sleep never came. He lay awake in a room designed for comfort, surrounded by a silence that felt louder than any city street. The mattress conformed perfectly to his body, the temperature calibrated to preference, the lighting soft and intentional. And yet none of it offered peace. The ceiling above him had cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime, yet it gave him nothing to hold on to. Her voice echoed in his mind, not loud, not dramatic, restrained, careful, weighted with years of caution and quiet courage. He replayed the moment she had almost refused the card, the way her body instinctively pulled back, the way she guarded her dignity like a final possession, something too precious to risk losing. For the first time in decades, his wealth felt useless against the weight of human reality. Money had always been his solution, to inconvenience, to fear, to uncertainty. It moved obstacles aside with ruthless efficiency, but lying there in the dark, he realized something deeply unsettling. Money had solved his problem so completely that it had also numbed him. It had insulated him from the raw edges of life, from the kinds of choices that carve character into a person. And then, there were her choices. Careful, selfless, intentional. She hadn't spent to impress or escape. She had spent to protect, to stabilize, to build. With almost nothing, she had revealed a discipline and clarity he rarely saw among those who had everything. The contrast shattered the numbness he hadn't known he was carrying. Alone in the dark, the billionaire cried, not from sadness, but from recognition, from the sudden collapse of a false hierarchy he had lived inside for years. He had spent his life accumulating power, influence, leverage, control. Yet it was a poor single mother, standing quietly in a grocery store aisle, who had reminded him what strength actually looked like. The next morning, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He wanted to find her, not to give more money, not to rescue her, but to understand her world. It wasn't easy. Her life existed far from the polished systems he controlled. There were no assistants to call, no databases to search, no shortcuts to take. For the first time in years, he moved without privilege guiding his steps, and that, more than the distance, unsettled him. When he finally stood outside her apartment, he hesitated. The building was modest, worn by time and weather, its walls carrying stories no one documented. He suddenly became aware of the distance between their realities, not measured in wealth, but in daily pressure, in the constant negotiation between needs and limits. When she opened the door, shock crossed her face, then discomfort, a flicker of instinctive caution. Still, after a pause that said more than words, she invited him in. Inside, the space was small but immaculate. Toys were neatly arranged along the wall, placed with care rather than abundance. A calendar hung near the kitchen, covered in circled dates and careful notes, rent, school fees, doctor appointments. Survival mapped out in ink, a system built not for growth, but for endurance. She apologized for the mess. There was none. As they spoke, she never asked for help, not once. She talked instead about things she barely allowed herself to voice. Dreams spoken softly, as if afraid they might draw attention and disappear. Stability, education, time. The luxury of planning beyond the next bill, the next week, the next emergency. She spoke of wanting to be present, of wanting her child to remember laughter more than struggle. And as he listened, something settled into place with painful clarity. She wasn't broken. She was exhausted. Exhausted from carrying responsibility without relief, from being strong without recognition, from surviving in a world that demanded resilience but rarely rewarded it. And the difference was everything. Because broken things need fixing, but exhausted people need understanding, respect, and systems that stop requiring heroism just to survive. When he left her apartment that day, he didn't feel like a savior. He felt like a student. And for the first time, he understood that real change doesn't begin with money. It begins with listening. He asked her a question he had never asked anyone before. What would you do if survival was no longer your main concern? She laughed softly, not out of humor but disbelief. The sound carried a fragile hesitation, as if the question itself were unsafe. Hope, when you've lived without it, can feel dangerous, like something that asks too much, too quickly. She thought for a moment before answering. She said she would study, not vaguely, not someday. She spoke of learning as if it were a door she had kept locked only because she couldn't afford the key. She said she would work, not less, but smarter, with intention, with room to grow instead of just endure. And she said she would teach her child kindness in a world that rarely returned it, because she refused to let hardship be the lesson that shaped his heart. There was no bitterness in her voice, no resentment, no blame. That absence stunned him. He had met people with far more money, more security, more opportunity, who were endlessly dissatisfied, always cataloging what the world still owed them. Yet here stood someone who had every reason to be angry, choosing grace instead, choosing forward motion, choosing values. In that moment, something inside him shifted. Not pity, respect. Respect for a strength that didn't demand recognition, for ambition that wasn't loud or entitled, but careful and deeply rooted, for a woman who had carried an unfair weight without letting it harden her. And he understood then that the greatest injustice wasn't poverty alone. It was how often the world failed to see the value of those who carried it silently. Over the weeks that followed, their lives began to intersect, carefully, deliberately. He refused to become a savior. He had learned that rescue often steals more than it gives. Instead, he offered structure, opportunity, and choice, the things that last when money runs out. Education programs that respected her time, childcare support that didn't come with scrutiny or shame, fair employment connections based on skill, not charity, always discreet, always without his name attached. She accepted only what preserved her independence. Every offer was weighed, considered, sometimes declined. That balance was fragile, and both of them protected it fiercely. Trust, they understood, survived only where dignity was left intact. Slowly, changes appeared. She began to stand taller, not from pride, but from relief. Her voice grew steadier as fear loosened its grip. Decisions no longer felt like traps, but pathways. She planned weeks ahead, then months. For the first time in years, the future felt like something she was allowed to touch, and every step she took forward felt like redemption for him. Not because he had saved her. He hadn't. But because he had finally used his power without erasing someone else's. Watching her grow reminded him of what wealth was meant to do. Not dominate, not impress, but support. He began to understand something profound. Wealth, when hoarded, decays. It isolates. It dulls empathy and distorts reality. But when shared with humility, when it becomes a bridge instead of a pedestal, it heals. Quietly, permanently. And in that quiet healing, both of them were transformed. Months later, he stood unnoticed at the back of a small school auditorium. The chairs were mismatched, the stage lights uneven, the air filled with the soft restlessness of parents shifting in their seats. No one recognized him. No one needed to. For the first time, anonymity felt like a gift. Her child was on stage. Small shoulders squared, voice trembling with nervous pride, the child spoke into the microphone. The topic was heroes. There was no dramatic pause, no hesitation. The answer came easily. My hero is my mom. The words landed softly, then grew stronger. The child spoke about her strength, how she always found a way, about her sacrifices, the things she gave up without complaint, about her endless love, the kind that showed up every morning, no matter how tired she was. The room filled with applause. The billionaire lowered his head as tears streamed down his face, not because of what he had given, but because of what he had learned. He saw with absolute clarity that his role had never been the center of the story. He had simply stepped aside long enough for the truth to be seen. That true impact wasn't measured in billions. It lived in moments where dignity was protected, where help arrived without humiliation, where strength was recognized instead of replaced. As he walked out into the night, the cool air pressing against his face, one truth followed him relentlessly. Lending his credit card for 24 hours had changed 2 lives. one that had been fighting to survive, and one that was finally learning how to feel again. Time moved forward, but the impact of that single day never loosened its grip on either of them. For her, it became a quiet anchor, something she returned to on nights when exhaustion threatened to pull her back into fear. She never told anyone about the credit card. Not her friends, not her co-workers. To her, it wasn't a story of generosity. It was a story of trust. And that trust changed how she saw herself. She walked with more certainty. She spoke without apologizing for existing. Slowly, cautiously, she allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond the next bill, the next emergency, the next sacrifice. Each small plan, each quiet ambition became a rebellion against the fear she had carried for so long. She began to dream in ways she had thought were luxuries, enrolling in courses, setting aside time for her own growth, imagining a life that didn't revolve solely around survival. For him, the memory became unavoidable. Every contract he signed, every company he acquired, forced him to ask a question he had ignored for decades. Does this create value, or does it only create profit? The question echoed in boardrooms, over spreadsheets, in meetings that once felt routine. Slowly, it reshaped his approach. He began walking away from deals that felt hollow, choosing instead investments that strengthened people rather than numbers. He stopped chasing applause. He started chasing meaning. And in the quiet spaces between acquisitions and decisions, in moments no one witnessed, he remembered a mother in a grocery store aisle. Her dignity intact, her choices deliberate, her courage unshakable. That memory became a compass, guiding him toward a life where wealth was not a measure of power, but a tool for restoring humanity. In their separate worlds, both of them carried the same lesson, that true impact is rarely loud, and that the most profound changes begin with trust, respect, and the courage to let someone step forward without fear. One afternoon, months later, a message appeared on his phone. It wasn't a request. It wasn't an emergency. It was simply news. She wrote that she had completed her first certification course, that she had been offered stable work with benefits, that she was moving forward. Her words were measured, restrained, almost afraid to sound proud, but pride surged through him anyway, sharp, sudden, overwhelming. Not the pride of ownership or control, not the satisfaction of power exercised, but the pride of witnessing someone rise through their own effort against odds he could barely comprehend. He typed a careful reply, congratulated her, reminded her that the achievement belonged entirely to her, that it was her dedication, her choices, her courage that had brought her here. When he set the phone down, his hands trembled. The realization hit him slowly, like a truth that had been waiting patiently in the quiet corners of his life. This was the success he had spent his life chasing without ever knowing it. A success that didn't inflate his ego, but softened it. One that didn't isolate him in towers or spreadsheets, but connected him to resilience, to humanity, to the profound beauty of someone claiming their own life. And for the first time, he understood that the greatest victories aren't measured in numbers, contracts, or acquisitions. They are measured in the quiet transformations we help make possible when we step aside enough to let someone stand on their own. Years later, the world would celebrate him as a visionary philanthropist. Articles would praise his generosity. Panels would invite him to speak about impact and leadership. Awards would line shelves and speeches would be recorded, broadcast, dissected. The narrative was tidy, complete, digestible. But none of them told the real story. None of them mentioned the poor single mother who once stood in a grocery store, calculating survival down to the last dollar. She was never named, never photographed, never thanked publicly. Yet she was the beginning of everything. She had taught him restraint without saying a word, had shown him humility through her choices, the careful deliberation behind each decision, the courage to live without surrendering dignity. She had proven that dignity was not something money could grant, only something money could either respect or destroy. And she had demanded silently that it be respected. Often, late at night, he wondered if she truly understood the depth of her influence. Because without realizing it, she had changed the course of a man who once believed power was the highest form of success. She had taught him that the measure of impact is not in the numbers you accumulate, but in the lives you honor. That true leadership is not about recognition, applause, or control. It is about understanding, listening, and creating space for others to rise. And though the world saw him as a philanthropist, he carried a deeper truth: that all the accolades, all the headlines, all the praise were echoes of a single act of quiet humanity performed in a grocery store aisle long before anyone even knew his name. She had been the spark, she had been the teacher, she had been everything. For her child, life transformed slowly, not into luxury, but into stability. Nights once filled with anxiety gave way to routine. Fear softened into predictability. Laughter replaced silence, filling rooms that had once known only quiet tension. The child grew up knowing struggle, but never shame, knowing effort, but also hope. And she made sure of that. She taught her child that accepting help did not mean surrendering pride. That integrity mattered more than wealth. That strength could exist in vulnerability, and courage could live in everyday choices. Every lesson was deliberate, each moment a quiet act of protection and preparation. The billionaire remained a distant figure, never glorified, never explained. A presence felt not in grandeur, but in absence, the absence of desperation that had once pressed down on their lives like a weight. That absence, subtle and steady, became fertile ground, and in that absence, something powerful took root. Confidence. Confidence to speak, to choose, to dream, to act without fear that every decision would cost more than they could bear. A sense of worth that was earned, not given. And as the child grew, she carried it forward, unaware of the full reach of a single act of trust that had rippled quietly, permanently, into their lives. Sometimes, long after the world had gone quiet, the billionaire would unfold the note she had given him on that first day. The paper had yellowed with time. The ink had faded slightly. Edges curled as if the weight of memory itself had bent them. But the words still carried the same weight, precise, honest, and quietly unyielding. He kept it not as a reminder of what he had given, but of what he had received. A reminder that one moment of trust could dismantle decades of emotional distance. That generosity didn't need an audience to be real. That a single act, small in appearance but immense in consequence, could alter the course of more than one life. And every time tears welled up again, he didn't wipe them away. He let them fall, because those tears proved something he once feared he had lost forever. He was no longer numb. He was no longer shielded behind walls of power and wealth. He was human again. And in that humanity, he found a clarity money could never buy. That true connection, trust, and dignity are treasures far richer than any fortune. And that sometimes, the simplest acts leave the deepest marks. Years passed and life unfolded in ways neither of them could have predicted. Then, on an ordinary afternoon that carried no warning of its importance, their paths crossed again. Not in a grocery store filled with quiet desperation, but in a community center alive with voices, warmth, and cautious hope. The hum of conversation and laughter filled the air, yet a careful order kept the space calm, intentional, safe. She stood at the front of the room as a guest speaker, invited to talk about resilience, education, and the unseen strength of single parents. Her presence was natural, unassuming, yet impossible to ignore. She moved with quiet authority, not commanding attention, but earning it through honesty and experience. He sat quietly in the back, intentionally unnoticed. He didn't take notes. He didn't fidget. He simply watched, absorbing every word, every gesture. As she spoke, he recognized the woman he had met years before, not softened by hardship, but shaped by it. Her voice was calm, her posture steady. Her words carried truth rather than performance. She never spoke of him, never mentioned the card. She didn't need to. Instead, she spoke about dignity, about how one moment of trust could reignite a person's belief in themselves, how restraint, integrity, and courage could quietly transform a life. She illustrated strength not through heroics, but through the everyday acts of survival, perseverance, and hope. With every sentence, his chest tightened. He realized slowly that she was still teaching him, decades later, in a room far from the place where it all began. And in that moment, he understood something he had never fully grasped before. True influence doesn't announce itself. It lingers quietly, reshaping lives long after the giver and receiver have gone their separate ways. She had once been the lesson, and she remained, still, the teacher. After the event ended and the room slowly emptied, he waited. When he finally approached her, recognition dawned in her eyes, followed by surprise, and then a gentle, knowing smile, the kind that carries both memory and forgiveness. Time had passed, but it hadn't diminished the bond forged in that single extraordinary day years before. They spoke softly, carefully, as two people aware of the gravity of shared history. No small talk, no pretense, just the quiet acknowledgement of what had been given, what had been learned, and what had endured. She thanked him again, not for the money, not for the opportunity, but for believing she would make the right choices when no one else had. Her gratitude wasn't performative. It was precise, heartfelt, the kind that lingers because it carries truth. His voice failed him. Words caught in his throat as tears filled his eyes openly, without shame or concealment. He told her, finally, that lending her his credit card had been the most meaningful decision of his life. Not the most profitable, not the most public, the most meaningful. And in that moment, the distance between them disappeared. No billionaire, no struggling mother, no hierarchy, no assumptions, no labels. Only two human beings standing in the quiet aftermath of a choice that had changed everything, a choice that had reshaped both of their lives forever. She listened with calm understanding, her gaze steady, and then said something that would stay with him forever.
"Kindness," she said softly, "didn't change me because it was large. It changed me because it was respectful, because it trusted my judgment, because it didn't reduce me to my circumstances." Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound. She continued, explaining that being seen as capable, truly capable, had restored her sense of worth long before stability arrived. Not money, not opportunity alone. Recognition of her humanity, her strength, her choices.
That acknowledgement had been the spark. As she spoke, tears streamed down his face freely, unbidden, unstoppable. For years, he had tried to fix the world with scale, systems, and strategy. He had believed that power could solve everything, that influence alone could dictate outcomes. Yet the truth was painfully simple. Dignity, once returned, multiplies itself. It grows quietly, persistently, beyond any ledger, any contract, any accolade. It regenerates hope. It reshapes lives. And the weight of that realization settled gently, but permanently, in his heart. He understood then that true impact is rarely loud. It doesn't demand headlines or applause. It begins with trust, with respect, and with the courage to honor someone's humanity above all else. In that moment, he knew he had finally learned the most important lesson of his life, one he would carry silently, gratefully, forever. As they parted, he watched her walk away with steady confidence, her steps deliberate, unhurried, no longer burdened by fear. Every movement spoke of a life reclaimed, of dignity restored, of courage quietly earned. Something inside him finally settled, a peace he had chased across boardrooms, countries, and fortunes and never found. For years, he had measured success by acquisitions, influence, and applause, yet none of it had reached this calm, this clarity. He understood now that wealth without empathy was hollow, that impact without humility was noise, that the true measure of a life well lived could not be broadcast, bought, or calculated. The world would never know the full story of what happened between them, and that was exactly how it should be. Some moments were too sacred for headlines, too honest for applause. They belonged only to the people transformed by them. And in that quiet, invisible exchange of trust, courage, and humanity, both of them had been changed forever. That night, alone once more, he placed her old note beside a new one he wrote himself. It wasn't for her, it was for him. A quiet reminder, a promise etched in ink, never to forget that the most powerful thing he had ever done wasn't building a billion-dollar empire. It was trusting a stranger to honor her own dignity. As tears fell onto the page, he smiled through them, grateful. Grateful not for what he had given, but for what he had received. For the lesson that wealth alone could never teach, that influence without respect was empty, and that human connection, once acknowledged, reshapes everything. Because in lending his credit card for 24 hours, he hadn't rescued a poor single mother. He had been rescued from a life where success meant nothing without humanity, where numbers eclipsed meaning, and where power had once felt like the highest form of achievement. And once that truth is learned, once that humility and understanding are truly felt, it can never be unlearned. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of it settle. For the first time in years, he felt whole. And he knew, finally, that this trust, dignity, compassion was the only fortune that truly mattered.